Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to unpack the really bold thesis behind David Korten's classic book, When Corporations Rule the World, and trace the fascinating, and maybe a little scary, evolution of global capitalism. We'll be looking closely at how the basic concept of a human organization was stretched, transformed, and ultimately replaced by the massive, autonomous entities that we know today as corporations. We'll explore the different historical chapters Korten maps out, analyze exactly how we got here, and then synthesize it all to understand his proposed solutions. So Korten argues that our modern world is experiencing what he calls a terminal system failure. His core analysis? Well, he says we've essentially shifted power away from living, breathing people and just handed it over to artificial corporate entities. And he suggests this isn't merely an economic shift. No, it's a profound transfer of global sovereignty that actually dictates how our societies function at the most fundamental levels. This quote really hits the nail on the head and perfectly sets up Korten's central premise. He contends that the relentless, programmed pursuit of money by global corporations is fundamentally at odds with the well-being of human communities and the Earth itself. Because a corporation's primary directive is literally just to replicate capital, the text argues that these institutions operate almost like artificial intelligence, valuing financial metrics entirely over human or ecological life. To really understand this transformation, we're going to walk through the book chronologically. We'll start with the origins of corporate power, move through the corporate libertarian assault, building global empires, a rogue financial system, the suicide economy, and finally, wrap up with creating a living economy. Starting with part 1, the origins of corporate power and early corporate rules. Let's see how this builds from the very beginning. Because early corporate charters were actually strictly controlled organizations meant to serve the public good. In early American history, a corporation just wasn't an independent powerhouse, it was a highly restricted tool. Now, a massive turning point arrived with the 1886 Supreme Court decision, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. According to the book, this decision unexpectedly granted these artificial corporate entities the legal personhood and constitutional protections of actual human beings. That is a real game changer. It set a precedent allowing corporations to claim the rights of citizens, like free speech, while completely avoiding a lot of the liabilities. By the 1890s, the age of the robber barons was in full swing, and corporations were using this newfound power to basically buy legislation and reshape the rules. It's crazy to think about, but early American settlers fiercely restricted these organizations. They ensured corporations could only exist to serve a clear public purpose. Get this, they weren't immortal, they actually had fixed lifespans, and owners carried personal liability. On top of that, state legislatures maintained the sovereign right to revoke a charter at literally any time if the public interest wasn't being served. Korten details how those laws were just gradually chipped away through aggressive legal battles funded by corporate interests. Moving right along to part 2, the corporate libertarian assault and rewriting the rules. Once corporations gained legal personhood, the text details a highly coordinated effort to radically rewrite the rules of governance. Basically, these new corporate entities needed an ideological framework to justify their massive expansion and to remove any remaining government oversight. So Korten uses a very specific term here. He calls it corporate libertarianism to describe this tight alignment of government and corporate interests. The book argues that this doctrine masquerades as free trade and free markets, but in reality, it doesn't free people at all. Instead, it frees global corporations from public accountability, allowing them to organize global economics entirely for their own profit. According to the source material, a huge catalyst for this shift was the 1971 Lewis Powell memo. Powell, who actually later became a Supreme Court justice, wrote this memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Korten explains that it sparked a highly organized, very generously funded assault by American businesses marshaling their resources. The goal was huge: reshape media, education, law, and politics. This effectively dismantled democratic pluralism so corporations could externalize their costs onto society without facing pushback. That brings us to part 3, building global empires and stateless corporations. Building on that big ideological shift, Korten explains how these entities grew way beyond any single nation to build actual global empires. The transition went from being a national company to a multinational one, and finally to something entirely untethered from any specific country. Korten specifically points to executives from massive corporations like IBM, National Cash Register, Unisys, GM, and Toyota.
In the text, these leaders proudly proclaimed that their firms had completely lost their national identities and morphed into these chameleon-like global forces. They can move factories and labs around the world seamlessly, effectively delinking their corporate interests from the interests of any specific nation or local community. It's pretty wild.
On to part 4, a rogue financial system detached from value. Here, Korten argues the whole system became dangerously detached from producing real goods. Instead of making goods and services that actually benefit society, the economy shifted toward just moving money around to simply create more money.
And this perfectly illustrates the concept of corporate cannibalism. Korten describes how extractive investors and corporate raiders actively prey on established, socially responsible companies. They target firms with cash reserves or sustainable practices, buy them out, and literally break them apart for immediate short-term profit. The text argues that the system forces managers to ask, what is the most immediately profitable thing to do, rather than asking, what is the right thing to do? What's really fascinating, and honestly highly ironic, is that Korten points out even Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism, warned against this exact scenario way back in 1776. Smith cautioned against large corporations where managers handle other people's money, noting it inevitably leads to negligence. Korten uses this to argue that these massive modern corporate entities are actually aggressively anti-market, mainly because they destroy the small, owner-managed enterprises that make actual free markets function efficiently in the first place.
Part 5 covers the suicide economy and its ultimate consequences. So having traced the organization from a strictly controlled local charter to a massive, stateless financial engine, the book lays out the ultimate and, frankly, devastating consequences of this evolution. Korten argues we face a very stark choice between two models. On one side, we have what he calls the suicide economy. This is a life-destroying, almost cancer-like system ruled by money-seeking corporate robots, prioritizing short-term profits and constantly centralizing power. On the flip side is the living economy. That's a decentralized system grounded in living systems ruled by actual people and focused on local self-reliance and democratic cooperation.
Finally, Part 6, Creating a Living Economy and Reclaiming Our Power. The book doesn't just diagnose the problem, it actually offers a specific agenda for how society can course-correct and put people and the earth first.
The book's agenda for democracy involves stripping corporations of their overwhelming power through some very actionable steps. First up, revoking the charters of repeat offenders. Second, getting corporations entirely out of politics by banning their lobbying and political contributions, since, let's remember, they aren't actually citizens. And third, eliminating corporate subsidies. Korten is reminding us here that a corporate charter is a revocable privilege granted by society. It is absolutely not an inalienable right. Korten synthesizes his argument by asserting that if we want a healthy society, we have to actively restore the balance. We must reconnect with kindred spirits and rebuild economies where markets are localized. In his view, people should cooperate to make a living rather than compete to make a killing. It's all about returning the power to govern back into the hands of living, breathing human beings. Understanding these concepts really equips you with the exact lens Korten uses to view global capitalism. It's a perspective he continues to expand upon in his later works, like The Great Turning, where he talks a lot about the necessary paradigm shift from an extractive empire to a cooperative Earth community. Ultimately, Korten leaves us with this really provocative thought: will life or money be humanity's defining value? The source material forces us to ask ourselves, will living people or artificial corporations determine the path to our collective future? It's a massive question, and it's one that challenges the very foundation of our modern global economy.